Welcome to my first vlog on the practical techniques in strength and conditioning module. In this vlog, I will explore strength and capacity issues in the execution of the Obits Quad and the Romanian Deadlift. Furthermore, I will try to analyze and explain why the different technical flaws originates from either a lack of skill or a lack of capacity. In this first video, we will look at an athlete who struggles to execute the overhead squat exercise for what I think is a lack of skill in the exercise. First of all, we see that the upper body is rotated to the left, and when he initiates the squat, he initiates with a forward translation of the knees. There's a lack of depth, and the knees are far in front of the toes, possibly due to the forward weight shift and the subsequent heel rise. If we dig a little deeper and try to analyze why these technical flaws happens, it seems like most of them stems from the athlete's initiation of the exercise. When the athlete initiates the movement with a forward translation of the knees, he quickly exploits his range of motion in ankle dorsiflexion. As a consequence, his only option to increase depth is by artificially creating more range of motion around the ankle joint. He accomplished this by shifting his weight to the forefoot, making the heel rise off the floor. Now, I would argue that this is an example of a lack of skill in the athlete. He's displaying pretty good ankle dorsiflexion before reaching the end range of motion, and the technical flaw could stem from him not being aware of how to best initiate the movement. Investigating this a little bit further, I tried to have him focusing on initiation with the hips and knees simultaneously. What you will quickly notice is that this results in him not getting his knees so far in front of his toes as before. He also keeps his feet flat on the floor during the execution of the movement, and even though he does not reach the same amount of depth as before, he is expressing a much more stable movement pattern. We see the same pattern when we go back and ask him to execute the movement with a weighted bar again. He's able to keep his feet flat on the floor during the execution of the movement, and he doesn't have to rely on artificially created range of motion around the ankle to execute the movement. When comparing the bottom positions of the first and the last execution of the movement, we can appreciate how much of a difference it can make to give a simple cue of initiating the movement with both the hips and knees simultaneously. It further highlights the fact that the poor technical execution of the first attempt was probably due to a lack of skill. Next, we will have a look at an athlete who is displaying a lack of capacity in the overhead squat exercise. So we see that he initiates the movement with both the knees and the hips simultaneously. There's a deep knee flexion and hips are below parallel in the bottom position, and the bar is slightly in front of the center of mass in the bottom position. I think we can all agree that he's displaying a very good movement pattern. He definitely has the required mobility to reach the bottom position exemplified with this image. However, he is displaying a little bit of knee valgus in the bottom position, and with the weight being a little bit in front of his center of mass in the bottom position, he could get in trouble when we start to load up the pattern. So here he is again, one more time doing the overhead squat, but this time with a weighted bar. He still initiates the movement with the knees and the hips simultaneously. The bar is now centered directly in top of his center of mass, and there is a big inwards collapse of the feet. And on this repetition he is shifting his weight backwards. So what we're basically seeing is As he redistributes his center of mass around the bar, he actually highlights some of the subtle flaws that he's displaying in the unweighted condition. This is mainly manifested in a huge inward collapse of the feet, which in turn exacerbates the valgus position of the knees. The backward weight shift could also be an indicator of a weak quadriceps or just simply lack of stabilization in the pattern. When we compare the bottom position of the two different loading conditions, we can see how the extra weight challenges the subtle technical flaws the athlete is displaying in unloaded condition. There is a high degree of inwards collapse of the knees and feet, which indicate that the athlete needs higher amount of strength in the quadriceps and the hip abductors to improve the movement. Moving on, we will look at an athlete who is displaying a lack of skill in the Romanian deadlift exercise. The athlete is displaying increased lumbar flexion in the bottom position. There's a lack of dissociation between the hip and the spine. There's no retraction of the shoulder blades, and he is displaying a huge amount of cervical extension. We are going to focus on the lack of dissociation between the hips and spine and the increased lumbar flexion. What we are often seeing when introducing athletes to the hinge pattern is the inability to execute the movement with a rigid spine and a posterior weight shift. To see if this was the case with this athlete, I had him execute different corrective exercises, focusing on shifting the weight posteriorly and keeping a rigid spine. I then had him execute the Romanian deadlift again, while keeping the different cues in mind. Now we definitely see better dissociation and less lumbar flexion. However, there are still issues to work on, as highlighted in the video. However, the most important take-home point for this athlete was that some simple cues and correctives were able to change the technical execution into a much more efficient hinge pattern. Lastly, we will look at an athlete who is displaying a lack of capacity in the Romanian deadlift exercise. This athlete is actually displaying a pretty good initial posterior weight shift, but when he gets to the second vertical marker, he doesn't go further back and actually shift his center of mass a little bit forward to reach depth. This results in him being in a very high position when he runs out of range of motion to posterior weight shift and has to flex his lumbar spine to reach depth. The issue is even further exacerbated when he tries to do the movement with an unweighted bar. Overall, these limitations could indicate that he has a mobility issue in the posterior chain. And to investigate this a little bit, I had him do a standing toe reach. As you can see, he's not nearly close to touching his toes, and this confirms that, at least in part, his inability to posterior weight shift is because of a lack of mobility in the posterior chain. To summarize, we have looked at skill and capacity issues in the overhead squat and the Romanian deadlift. Now, I don't think that any of the athletes I have shown has displayed technical flaws that exclusively stems from either skill or capacity issues. In other words, it's not black and white, and I do think that an athlete can display issues that originates from both skill and capacity deficits in the safe movement pattern. What characterizes a lack of skill, and what I have tried to highlight in the example in this video, is that the athlete possesses the underlying physiological capacities to express the skill, but for some reason lacks the necessary motor control and/or knowledge to execute it. As a result, we should be able to see substantial changes in the movement pattern after providing the athlete with the appropriate cues and correctives. Lastly, a lack of capacity entails that one of the fundamental physiological capacities for correct execution of the skill is missing. In the two examples I have shown, we have talked about deficits in strength and mobility. Being factors with a relatively long window of adaptation, we are not going to see the same amount of immediate changes in the movement pattern, as we can see in issues with lack of skill.